Rest stops are supposed to be safe places for travelers to take a break. But for the people in tonight's stories, these roadside stops became the setting for their worst nightmares. Tonight, I'm sharing 11 disturbing encounters that happened at rest stops across America. Stories so unsettling, they'll make you think twice about your next highway pit stop. These are 11 disturbing true rest stop horror stories. I've driven that stretch of Interstate 80 through Nebraska more times than I can count. It's not exactly scenic, just endless cornfields and the occasional farmhouse dotting the horizon. But it's the fastest route between my college in Colorado and my parents' house in Iowa. December 2023 was my junior year, and I was making the familiar drive home for winter break. The weather had been decent when I left Boulder that morning. But by the time I hit the Nebraska border, snow was starting to fall pretty heavily. I'd been driving for about 6 hours straight, surviving on gas station coffee and energy drinks, when I realized I desperately needed to use the bathroom. My gas tank was getting low too, and I figured I should probably grab something more substantial to eat than the stale donuts I'd been living on. I knew there was usually a rest stop somewhere around mile marker 126, so I started watching the signs carefully through the increasing snowfall. When I saw the blue sign with the white symbols indicating a rest area ahead, I felt a wave of relief. My bladder was practically screaming at me, and my hands were getting cramped from gripping the steering wheel so tightly in the deteriorating weather conditions. The exit ramp curved off to the right, and I followed it down into what looked like a pretty standard rest stop layout, a rectangular parking area with the usual brick building containing restrooms and vending machines. But something felt off immediately. For one thing, the parking lot was almost completely empty, except for a single pickup truck parked way over in the far corner. An old Ford that looked like it had seen better decades. The truck was a faded red color, though it was hard to tell in the dim lighting, and it was covered with enough rust and dents that I wondered how it was still running. More concerning was the fact that the building itself looked wrong somehow. The exterior lights were working, but they cast everything in this weird yellowish glow that made the falling snow look almost sickly. The windows were dark, and I couldn't see any signs of life inside. I sat in my car for a minute, engine running, trying to decide if I should just push on to the next town. But the need to use the bathroom was becoming urgent, and my gas gauge was hovering dangerously close to empty. The next exit might be 20 or 30 miles away, and with this weather, I didn't want to risk running out of fuel in the middle of nowhere. So I parked as close to the building entrance as possible, grabbed my keys and wallet, made a run for the door through the swirling snow. The first thing I noticed when I pushed through the heavy glass door was the smell. It wasn't exactly bad, but it was strange. Like old cigarettes mixed with something metallic and sharp that I couldn't quite identify. The interior lighting was even worse than outside, with several fluorescent bulbs flickering intermittently and casting dancing shadows on the walls. The building was laid out exactly like every other rest stop I'd ever been in. Restrooms to the left, vending machines along the right wall, and a small seating area with plastic chairs and tables in the center. But everything looked old. Not just outdated, but old in a way that suggested this place had been abandoned for years. The vending machines were empty, their fronts cracked and covered with a layer of dust. One of them was tilted at an odd angle, like someone had tried to tip it over and given up halfway through. The floor tiles were cracked and stained, and several of them were missing entirely, revealing the concrete substrate underneath. Water stains on the ceiling suggested roof leaks, and there were dark patches on the walls that could have been mold or something worse. I hesitated for a moment, wondering if the facilities would even be functional. But my body made the decision for me. I headed toward the men's restroom, pushing open a door that creaked loudly on its hinges. Inside, things were even worse. Half the lights were completely dead, leaving large sections of the room in deep shadow. The mirrors were cracked and spotted with age, and the sinks were stained with rust and mineral deposits. But the toilets seemed to be working, which was all that really mattered at that point. I took care of business as quickly as possible, not wanting to spend any more time in that unsettling place than absolutely necessary. The whole time, I kept hearing odd sounds: pipes clanking, the building settling, and what sounded like footsteps echoing from somewhere else in the facility. When I went to wash my hands, the water that came out of the faucet was a disturbing brownish color for the first few seconds before running clear. By the time I made it back to the main area, I was definitely ready to get out of there. I didn't even bother checking the vending machines, figuring they probably hadn't worked in years anyway. I pushed back through the entrance door and jogged through the snow to my car, keys already in my hand. That's when things got really weird. I started my engine and began backing out of my parking space, planning to head straight back to the entrance ramp and get back on the highway. But as I drove toward what I thought was the exit, I realized that the road didn't lead back up to I-80. Instead, it curved off into the darkness in a direction that didn't make any sense. According to my mental map of the area, the entrance ramp had come from the east, so the exit should lead back in that direction. But this road was heading north into what looked like empty farmland. I stopped the car and pulled out my phone, thinking maybe I'd gotten turned around in the parking lot. But when I opened my GPS app, it showed my location as a blank area with no roads marked at all. The blue dot representing my position was sitting in the middle of what appeared to be an empty field, miles away from any highway. I refreshed the app several times, but the result was always the same. That's when I noticed the pickup truck. The old red Ford had moved. When I'd first arrived, it had been parked in the far corner of the lot, facing toward the building. Now it was positioned near the exit road, and it was facing in my direction. I couldn't see through the windshield because of the snow and the poor lighting. But I had the distinct impression that someone was sitting behind the wheel, watching me. I decided to try a different approach. Maybe I'd somehow missed the real exit in the dark and the snow. I drove slowly around the perimeter of the parking lot, looking for another road that might lead back to the highway. But there was only the one exit, the one that led north into the darkness. Every time I completed a circuit of the lot, the pickup truck had moved to a new position, always keeping itself between my car and the exit road. By this point, my heart was starting to race. I tried calling 911, but my phone showed no signal. I tried calling my parents, my roommate, anyone, but nothing would go through. The GPS was still showing my location as somewhere that didn't exist, and the fuel gauge was reminding me that I didn't have unlimited time to figure this out. I decided to just go for it. Whatever was going on with that pickup truck, I needed to get out of there. I drove toward the exit road, hoping that once I got moving, I'd be able to figure out how to get back to the highway. The pickup truck started moving too, pulling out of its parking space and following behind me with its headlights off. The road led through what looked like abandoned farmland, with broken fence posts and the skeletal remains of old corn stalks poking up through the snow. There were no other lights visible anywhere, no farmhouses or barns or anything that suggested human habitation. Just the narrow asphalt road stretching ahead into the darkness, with the pickup truck following silently behind me. After what felt like miles, but was probably only a few minutes, I saw lights ahead. As I got closer, I realized with a sinking feeling that I was approaching the same rest stop I'd just left. Same brick building, same sickly yellow lights, same empty parking lot. I had somehow driven in a complete circle. The pickup truck pulled into the parking lot behind me and resumed its original position in the far corner. This time, I could see a figure silhouetted behind the wheel, but I couldn't make out any details in the poor light. I sat in my car for a long time, trying to figure out what to do. Every time I tried the exit road, the same thing happened. A long drive through empty farmland that somehow led right back to the rest stop. The pickup truck followed me every time, always with its lights off, always maintaining the same distance behind me. It wasn't until the snow started to let up around dawn that I finally saw it. A second road, barely visible in the growing light, that branched off from the main exit about half a mile from the rest stop. In the darkness and the heavy snow, I'd been driving right past it every time. This road led up an embankment and connected to what was obviously Interstate 80. Within minutes, I was back on the familiar highway, with normal traffic and regular mile markers and rest stops that looked like they'd been built sometime in the current century. I never did figure out what that place was or why my GPS couldn't locate it. I've driven that same road dozens of times since then, and I've never seen that rest stop again. There's supposed to be one around mile marker 126, but it's a completely different facility. Modern, well-lit, and definitely not abandoned. Sometimes I wonder if I just took a wrong turn in the snow and ended up at some old rest stop that had been closed for years. But that doesn't explain the pickup truck, or the road that led in a circle, or why my GPS showed me in the middle of an empty field. I still drive I-80 when I need to get home, but now I make sure to fill up my gas tank before I hit Nebraska, and I never stop at rest areas after dark. My name is Weston, and I've been driving long haul for about 15 years now. I've seen pretty much everything you can see on America's highways: accidents, weather disasters, roadside emergencies, and more than my fair share of strange people doing strange things at all hours of the night. When you're pulling an 18-wheeler across the country on a regular schedule, you develop a sixth sense about situations that don't feel right. That sense saved my life one night at a truck stop in New Mexico. This happened back in March of last year. I was hauling a load of electronics from a warehouse in Phoenix to a distribution center in Dallas, running on a tight deadline that had me driving through the night to make my delivery window. I'd been on the road since late afternoon, and by the time I hit the stretch of Interstate 40 between Albuquerque and Santa Rosa, it was well past midnight. My fuel gauge was getting low, and I was due for my mandatory rest break anyway. So when I saw the familiar blue signs for the Desert Rose truck stop at mile marker 218, I decided to pull in. The Desert Rose was one of those 24-hour operations that catered specifically to long-haul drivers. Big parking area for semis, diesel pumps, a restaurant that stayed open all night, showers, and a convenience store stocked with everything a trucker might need. I'd stopped there plenty of times over the years, and it was always busy, even in the middle of the night. Truckers don't keep regular hours, so these places see steady traffic around the clock. But that night felt different from the moment I pulled into the lot. For one thing, it was unusually quiet. There were only a handful of other trucks parked in the designated spaces, which was weird for a prime location like this on a major freight corridor. The parking lot lighting seemed dimmer than usual, and several of the overhead lights were flickering or completely dark. Even the big neon sign advertising the truck stop was only half lit, with the desert part completely black. I found a parking spot near the fuel island and went through my usual routine, checking my load straps, doing a quick walk-around inspection of my rig, and logging my hours in my electronic logbook. The whole time, I had this nagging feeling that something was off, but I couldn't put my finger on exactly what it was. The place looked normal enough, just quieter and darker than I was used to. As I was finishing up my inspection, I noticed an RV parked over in the area designated for regular vehicles. It was one of those big Class A motorhomes, probably worth more than I make in 2 years. But it looked like it had seen some hard miles. The thing that caught my attention wasn't the RV itself, though. It was the family standing next to it. There were 4 of them, a man and woman who looked to be in their 40s, and 2 kids who couldn't have been more than 8 or 10 years old. They were standing in a tight group next to the RV's door. Something about their body language immediately set off alarm bells in my head. The parents kept looking around nervously, scanning the parking lot like they were expecting trouble. But what really bothered me were the kids. They were standing perfectly still and completely silent, staring straight ahead with this blank expression that just wasn't natural for children that age. I watched them for a few minutes while I finished my inspection, trying to figure out what was bothering me so much about the scene. The family wasn't doing anything obviously wrong. They were just standing there. But there was something mechanical about their movements, like they were going through the motions of being a normal family without actually being one. I needed to fuel up and grab some coffee, so I headed toward the main building. The convenience store was brighter than the parking lot, but it still felt off somehow. There was only one person working, a woman in her 50s with graying hair pulled back in a ponytail and tired eyes that suggested she'd been pulling the night shift for way too long. She looked up when I walked in, and I could see relief wash over her face. "Thank God," she said quietly as I approached the counter. I was starting to think I was going to be alone in here all night. I glanced around the store. It was empty except for the 2 of us. "Slow night?" I asked. She shook her head. "That's just it. It's not slow. That family out there has been here for 6 hours." I looked back toward the parking lot through the big windows at the front of the store. The family was still standing in the exact same position next to their RV, like they hadn't moved at all since I'd first noticed them. 6 hours? I repeated. What have they been doing? "That's what's so weird," the cashier said, lowering her voice even though we were the only people in the store. "They keep coming in here, buying the exact same things over and over again. Every hour on the hour, the dad comes in and buys 2 bags of chips, 2 sodas, and a pack of gum. Same brands every time. He pays in cash, exact change, doesn't say a word except thank you. Then he goes back outside, and they all stand there for another hour." I felt a chill run down my spine. "Have you asked them if they need help? Maybe their RV broke down or something?" I tried talking to him the 3rd time he came in, asked if everything was okay. He just stared at me for about 10 seconds without saying anything, then completed his purchase and left. The weird thing is, I never see them eating the food or drinking the sodas. And those kids, they haven't moved from that spot in 6 hours, haven't used the bathroom, haven't asked for anything, haven't even spoken to each other. I looked out at the family again. From this angle, I could see their faces more clearly in the light spilling out from the store windows. The parents looked normal enough, if a little tired and stressed. But the kids definitely looked wrong. Their eyes were open, and they were clearly conscious. But they had this vacant, glassy-eyed stare that reminded me of mannequins in a department store. "When's the last time they came in?" I asked. The cashier checked the clock on the wall. "About 15 minutes ago. So they should be back in 45 minutes if they stick to their pattern." I decided I needed to fuel up and get out of there. Whatever was going on with that family, it wasn't something I wanted to get involved in. I'd seen enough strange stuff on the road to know that sometimes the best course of action is to mind your own business and keep moving. I grabbed a large coffee and a couple of energy bars, paid the cashier, and headed back outside to fuel my truck. The family was still in their exact same position, and as I got closer to them on my way to the diesel pumps, I could hear something that made my blood run cold. They were humming. All four of them were humming the same tune in perfect unison. Some melody I didn't recognize, but it had this haunting, almost hypnotic quality that made my skin crawl. The parents were swaying slightly in rhythm with the music, but the kids remained perfectly still. Their eyes never blinked, never moved to track my movement, never showed any awareness of their surroundings at all. I fueled up as quickly as possible, trying not to stare at the family, but unable to completely ignore them. The humming continued the entire time, never wavering, never stopping. It was like background music in a horror movie. Technically pleasant, but deeply unsettling in context. As I was hanging up the fuel nozzle, the humming suddenly stopped. I looked over and saw the father walking toward the convenience store, moving with the same mechanical precision I'd noticed before. The rest of the family remained in position, still as statues. I should have gotten in my truck and driven away right then. I had a delivery to make, and I was already running behind schedule. But something made me follow the father into the store, keeping my distance, but close enough to observe. The cashier saw him coming and shot me a look that was equal parts fear and desperation. The father walked directly to the snack aisle, selected 2 bags of chips, the exact same brand and flavor, then went to the drink cooler and grabbed 2 sodas. Finally, he picked up a pack of gum from the display near the register. The whole process took exactly 3 minutes, and he moved with the efficiency of someone who had done this exact routine many times before. When he approached the counter, he placed the items down in a precise arrangement and pulled out exact change from his pocket without counting it. "Thank you," he said to the cashier in a flat, emotionless voice. But here's the thing that really freaked me out. As he was leaving, he turned and looked directly at me. Not a casual glance, but a long, sustained stare that lasted at least 10 seconds. His eyes were completely normal looking, but there was something behind them that wasn't quite human. It was like looking at a very sophisticated puppet that was almost, but not quite, convincing as a real person. He left without saying anything else, and I watched through the window as he rejoined his family. They didn't acknowledge his return in any way. Didn't look at the items he'd purchased, didn't move to get back in the RV, didn't break their formation at all. Within seconds, they had resumed their synchronized humming. The cashier grabbed my arm as I started to leave. "Please," she whispered, "don't leave me alone with them. My shift doesn't end until 6 a.m., and I don't think I can handle 4 more hours of this." I looked at the clock. It was just past 3:30. I was already behind schedule, and I needed to get back on the road if I was going to make my delivery window. But the terror in this woman's eyes was real, and I couldn't bring myself to abandon her. "Call the police," I suggested. "Tell them there's a suspicious vehicle that's been loitering for hours." "I already tried," she said. "They said unless the family is actually breaking the law or causing a disturbance, there's nothing they can do. Apparently, it's not illegal to stand in a parking lot and buy snacks." I spent the next 2.5 hours in that convenience store, drinking coffee and pretending to read trucking magazines while keeping one eye on the family outside. Every hour on the hour, the father would come in and repeat his exact same purchasing routine. Same items, same arrangement on the counter, same emotionless thank you, same unsettling stare at me before leaving. The humming never stopped, except for the brief periods when the father was inside the store. The rest of the family would stand in complete silence until he returned, then immediately resume their synchronized melody. Around 6 a.m., just as the day shift cashier was arriving to relieve the night worker, something finally changed. The family suddenly stopped humming and, moving as a unit, climbed into their RV. The engine started on the first try, and they drove out of the parking lot without any of the mechanical issues you'd expect from a vehicle that had been sitting idle for 8 hours. I followed them to the highway entrance and watched as they merged onto Interstate 40 heading east. Their RV looked completely normal in the morning light. Just another family on a road trip. But I knew what I'd witnessed, and I knew it wasn't normal. The day shift cashier told me later that the night worker had quit effective immediately and moved to a different state within the week. I don't blame her. I've stopped at the Desert Rose truck stop several times since then, but always during daylight hours, and I've never seen that family again. To this day, I can't get that humming out of my head. Sometimes, when I'm driving late at night and the road starts to hypnotize me, I catch myself humming that same haunting melody. When that happens, I pull over at the next truck stop, get some coffee, and call my wife just to hear a normal human voice. I still don't know what that family was, or what they were doing there for 8 hours. But I'm glad I stayed with that cashier, and I'm even gladder that I never had to find out what would have happened if I'd been alone with them. My name is Belen, and I never considered myself particularly paranoid or overly cautious. I'm a single mom raising my 8-year-old daughter, Coraline, and over the years I've gotten pretty good at handling unexpected situations on my own. But what happened to us at a rest stop in Ohio last summer taught me that sometimes your instincts are trying to tell you something important, even when everything on the surface seems perfectly normal. It was July 15th, 2024, and Coraline and I were driving from our home in Detroit down to visit my sister in Atlanta. We'd planned to make the drive in 2 days, stopping overnight in Lexington, Kentucky. But we'd gotten a late start that morning due to last-minute packing and a minor crisis involving Coraline's forgotten stuffed animal. By the time we crossed into Ohio on I-75, it was already mid-afternoon and unseasonably hot for July. The kind of oppressive heat that makes the asphalt shimmer and turns your car into an oven, even with the air conditioning running. We'd been on the road for about 3 hours when I started hearing a noise from under the hood that I didn't like. It wasn't loud or dramatic, just a subtle ticking sound that seemed to get more noticeable when I accelerated. I'm not mechanically inclined, but I know enough about cars to recognize when something isn't right. The temperature gauge was still in the normal range, but I could see it creeping higher than usual, and that combination of symptoms made me nervous. Coraline was in the back seat with her iPad and headphones, completely absorbed in some cartoon she'd downloaded for the trip, so she hadn't noticed anything wrong. I didn't want to worry her unnecessarily, but I also didn't want to risk having the car break down completely while we were still hours away from our destination. When I saw signs for a rest area ahead, I decided it would be smart to pull over and take a look. The rest stop was one of those typical Ohio Department of Transportation facilities. A large brick building with separate men's and women's restrooms, a small information center, and several picnic tables scattered around a grassy area dotted with mature oak trees. The parking lot was about half full, which was normal for a weekday afternoon in the summer. There were families with kids running around, a few elderly couples walking their dogs, and the usual mix of cars with out-of-state plates that you see at highway rest stops. I parked in a spot that offered some shade from one of the big oak trees and popped the hood. The engine bay looked normal enough to my untrained eye, No obvious leaks, no smoke, no loose belts or hoses. But the ticking sound was definitely coming from somewhere in there. And I could feel heat radiating off the engine that seemed excessive, even for a hot day. That's when the man approached me. He looked to be in his late 40s or early 50s, average height and build, wearing khaki shorts and a blue polo shirt that suggested he might be on vacation or traveling for business. He had graying hair, wire-rimmed glasses, and the kind of friendly, approachable demeanor that immediately puts you at ease. Everything about him screamed harmless middle-aged dad. "Car trouble?" he asked with a concerned smile as he walked over from where he'd apparently been sitting at one of the picnic tables. "I'm not sure," I replied, grateful for the offer of help. "There's a ticking noise, and the temperature seems to be running higher than normal. I don't know much about cars, so I thought I'd better stop and take a look." He nodded knowingly and moved closer to peer into the engine bay. "Mind if I take a look?" I'm pretty handy with cars. Had to learn when my kids were younger and we were doing a lot of road trips on a tight budget. I hesitated for just a moment, but he seemed genuinely helpful, and there were plenty of other people around. That would be great, actually. I'd really appreciate it. He spent several minutes examining the engine, pointing out various components and explaining what he was looking for in terms that were simple enough for me to follow. He seemed knowledgeable and professional, and I started to relax. It looked like I'd gotten lucky. Instead of being stranded with car trouble, I'd found someone who could actually help. But then he started asking questions that made me slightly uncomfortable. "So, where are you folks headed?" he asked casually as he checked the oil level. "Atlanta," I replied. "Visiting family." "That's a long drive from Michigan," he said, glancing at my license plate. "You planning to drive straight through, or are you stopping somewhere overnight?" The question seemed innocent enough, but something about the way he asked it bothered me. "We'll probably stop somewhere along the way," I said vaguely. "Smart thinking," he nodded. "Driving at night can be dangerous, especially with kids. What's your little girl's name?" I looked back at the car where Coraline was still absorbed in her iPad, completely oblivious to our conversation. "Coraline," I said without thinking. "Pretty name," he said, but his eyes lingered on her for just a moment too long. "How old is she?" 8, I replied. But even as I said it, I wondered why he needed to know. He continued his examination of the engine, but the questions kept coming. "You said you're visiting family in Atlanta. Is that your parents? Siblings?" "My sister," I answered, starting to feel like I was being interviewed rather than helped. "She expecting you at a specific time?" I ask because if this is what I think it is, you might want to call and let her know you could be delayed. "What do you think is wrong?" I asked, trying to redirect the conversation away from my travel plans. "Could be a few things," he said, straightening up and wiping his hands on a rag he'd pulled from his pocket. "The good news is it's probably not serious. Likely just needs some coolant or maybe a thermostat replacement. The bad news is you probably shouldn't drive it too far without getting it looked at." I felt my heart sink. How far is too far? "Well," he said, glancing around the rest stop, "there's a garage about 10 miles south of here that I know does good work. Family-owned place, very honest. I could follow you there in my car. Make sure you don't have any problems on the way." Something about this suggestion immediately set off alarm bells in my head. Maybe it was the way he'd been asking so many personal questions, or maybe it was just maternal instinct. But the idea of driving to an isolated garage with a stranger following behind us felt wrong. "That's very kind of you," I said. "But I think we'll be okay." Maybe I'll just add some coolant and see how it goes. His expression didn't change, but I caught a flash of something in his eyes that might have been annoyance. I really wouldn't recommend that, he said. If the thermostat is going bad, adding coolant won't help, and you could end up stranded on the highway. I appreciate the advice, I said, moving toward the driver's side door. But I think we'll manage. Are you sure? He pressed. It's really no trouble for me to follow you to the garage. I was heading south anyway. I was starting to feel genuinely uncomfortable now. His persistence was beginning to feel less like helpfulness and more like pressure. Really, we'll be fine, I said firmly. Thank you for taking a look. I got in the car and started the engine, expecting him to take the hint and walk away. Instead, he stood next to my open window, still talking. You know, he said, if you change your mind, I'll be around for a while. I'm in the white sedan over there. He pointed to a car parked several spaces away that I hadn't noticed before. Just flash your lights if you need help. I nodded politely, put the car in reverse, and backed out of the parking space. In my rearview mirror, I could see him standing there watching us leave, his hands in his pockets, that friendly smile still on his face. We drove for about 5 minutes before I realized I should probably stop and actually add some coolant just to be safe. There was a gas station just off the next exit, so I pulled in and parked next to the convenience store. Coraline was asking for a snack anyway, so it seemed like good timing. While Coraline picked out chips and a drink inside the store, I bought a jug of coolant and went back to add it to the radiator. The engine had cooled down enough that it was safe to open the radiator cap, and I could see that the coolant level was indeed low. As I was pouring in the new coolant, I noticed a piece of paper tucked under my windshield wiper. My blood went cold when I unfolded it. Written in blue ink, in neat block letters, was my home address in Detroit. Not just the street name and number, but my complete address, including the zip code. Below that, someone had written, "Pretty house." Nice neighborhood for kids. I looked around the gas station parking lot frantically, but I didn't see the white sedan or the helpful stranger anywhere. There were other customers coming and going, but no one who looked familiar or suspicious. Whoever had left the note had done it quietly and quickly. I crumpled up the paper and threw it away, then hurried back into the convenience store to get Coraline. My hands were shaking as I paid for our items, and I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see that friendly face with the wire-rimmed glasses. "Mom, are you okay?" Coraline asked as we got back in the car. "You look scared." "I'm fine, sweetheart," I lied. "Just tired from all the driving." I called my sister as soon as we got back on the highway and told her what had happened. She wanted me to call the police, but what was I going to tell them? A man had helped me with car trouble and somehow knew my address? That wasn't necessarily illegal, even though it was terrifying. Instead, I drove straight to the first police station I could find and asked an officer to follow us to our hotel for the night. I explained the situation, and while he couldn't take an official report, he was kind enough to make sure we got to our rooms safely and gave me his card in case anything else happened. We stayed at a different hotel than the one I'd originally booked, and I paid cash instead of using my credit card. I also kept the curtains closed and didn't let Coraline go to the pool or the hotel restaurant. We ordered room service and watched movies until it was time to sleep. The next morning, I called the rest stop where we'd met the man and described him to the maintenance staff. They said they'd keep an eye out, but pointed out that thousands of people pass through there every day, I also called the police in my hometown and asked them to do extra patrols around my house for the next few weeks. Nothing else happened during our trip to Atlanta, and we made it home without incident. But I had our locks changed the day after we got back, and I installed a security system the following week. I also signed Coraline up for self-defense classes and started carrying pepper spray in my purse. To this day, I don't know how that man got my address. Maybe he saw my registration through the windshield when I had the hood up, or maybe he somehow got access to my license plate information. But the fact that he had it, combined with all those personal questions he'd been asking, tells me that his intentions were not good. I still think about that day whenever I have car trouble or need to stop at a rest area. That man seemed so normal, so helpful, so trustworthy. If my instincts hadn't kicked in when they did, I don't know what might have happened to us. Now I trust those instincts completely, even when they don't make logical sense. Sometimes the most dangerous people are the ones who seem the most harmless. My name is Valentine, and I've been fascinated by radio communications since I was a kid. What started as a hobby with a basic CB radio in my bedroom has evolved over the years into a serious interest in amateur radio, emergency communications, and radio frequency theory. I hold an extra class license and operate a pretty sophisticated mobile setup in my truck that lets me communicate with people all over the world while I'm traveling. It's a passion that has taken me to some remote places and introduced me to some amazing people. But it also led me to experience something that still gives me nightmares 3 years later. In October of 2021, I was driving solo from Reno to Denver, taking the scenic route through Nevada on Highway 50, what locals call the loneliest road in America. I'd made this drive several times before, always fascinated by the stark beauty of the high desert and the incredible radio propagation conditions you can get in that vast, empty landscape. With minimal radio frequency interference from cities or industrial sources, it's one of the best places in the country for long-distance amateur radio communications. I'd left Reno around noon, planning to drive straight through to Denver in about 10 hours. The weather was perfect. Clear skies, comfortable temperature, and excellent visibility across the endless sagebrush plains. My mobile radio setup was working flawlessly, and I'd already made several contacts with stations in Japan and Australia, taking advantage of some unusual atmospheric conditions that were enhancing long-distance propagation. Around midnight, I was getting tired and needed to stretch my legs. So when I saw signs for a rest area near mile marker 112, I decided to pull over for a break. The rest stop was typical for that part of Nevada. A small brick building with basic facilities, a few picnic tables, and an informational display about local history and wildlife. The parking area was completely empty, which wasn't surprising given the late hour and remote location. I parked under one of the few functioning overhead lights and shut off the engine. The silence was immediate and profound. No traffic noise, no city sounds, just the vast quiet of the high desert under a canopy of stars, more brilliant than anything you can see near populated areas. It was exactly the kind of environment I loved for serious radio work. I decided to set up my portable antenna and do some late-night operating while I took my break. I had a nice collapsible vertical antenna that I could deploy quickly, along with a battery-powered transceiver that would let me operate independently of my truck's electrical system. Within about 10 minutes, I had everything assembled and was ready to get on the air. I started scanning through the amateur bands, listening for activity and checking propagation conditions. The 40-meter band was particularly active, with stations from all across North America coming through clearly despite the late hour. I made a few contacts with other night owls, a trucker in Montana, an insomniac in Florida, and a shift worker in Alaska who was just getting off work. Around 12:45 a.m., I decided to switch to the 80-meter band and see what was happening on the lower frequencies. I was slowly tuning across the band when I picked up a transmission that immediately caught my attention. It wasn't the content of the transmission that was unusual. It was the signal strength and clarity. The signal was coming through at full scale on my signal strength meter, which suggested the transmitting station was very close by. But out here in the middle of nowhere, that didn't make sense. The voice was that of a young man, probably in his 20s, and he sounded terrified. "This is KC7ABX Mobile. Emergency traffic. Emergency traffic," the voice was saying. "I'm stranded at a rest stop on Highway 50, mile marker 112. My vehicle won't start and my cell phone has no signal. I've been here for over 2 hours and haven't seen another car. If anyone copies this, please contact local authorities and request assistance." I grabbed my microphone immediately. A fellow amateur radio operator in distress was exactly the kind of situation our emergency communications networks were designed to handle. "KC7ABX, this is KF7QRS, I transmitted. "I copy your emergency traffic. What is your current status and how can I assist?" But there was no response. The transmission continued as if he hadn't heard me. "The rest stop facilities appear to be abandoned," the voice continued. "The restrooms are locked and the vending machines are empty. I'm getting really concerned because I don't have enough water to last much longer in this heat, and my car's radiator seems to be leaking." I tried calling him again, but again got no response. It was like he was transmitting on a frequency where he could send but not receive. I checked my equipment to make sure I was transmitting properly. My SWR meter showed a perfect match, and my power output was normal. Then something he said made my blood run cold. "I can see my location on my GPS," the voice said. "It shows mile marker 112 on Highway 50. But the weird thing is, the timestamp on my GPS is showing July 15th, 2018. That can't be right. It's July 15th, 2021. I looked at my own GPS display. It showed my location as mile marker 112 on Highway 50, and the date as October 18th, 2021. The voice I was hearing was claiming to be at the exact same location where I was sitting, but 3 years in the past. I got out of my truck and looked around the rest stop area carefully. The parking lot was empty, except for my vehicle. There were no other cars, no people, no signs of anyone having been there recently. The facilities were clearly operational. I could see lights inside the building, and the vending machines were stocked and humming quietly. But the voice on the radio continued describing a completely different scene. The information display board here shows something about a local mining operation, but the text is faded and I can barely read it, he was saying. There's graffiti on the building walls and several of the windows are broken. This place looks like it's been abandoned for years. I walked over to the information display he was describing. It was in perfect condition, with clear, readable text about the area's history and well-maintained photographs of local wildlife. There was no graffiti anywhere, and all the windows were intact. I tried transmitting again, this time giving my exact location and asking if he could hear me. Still no response. It was becoming clear that this wasn't a normal radio contact. The transmission continued for another 20 minutes, with the stranded operator describing his increasingly desperate situation. He talked about rationing his remaining water, trying unsuccessfully to flag down passing vehicles, and his growing fear that he might not survive until morning. His voice became progressively more panicked as the transmission went on. Then, abruptly, the transmission changed tone. "Wait," the voice said. suddenly sounding confused rather than frightened. There's someone else here. I can see headlights pulling into the parking lot. There was a pause filled with static. It's a pickup truck, he continued. The driver's getting out. He's walking toward me. Maybe he can help. Another pause, longer this time. Something's wrong, the voice said, and now he sounded terrified again. The man from the truck, there's something wrong with him. He's not walking right. His movements are jerky like a puppet, and his face. The transmission dissolved into static for several seconds, then came back weaker, but still audible. He's not human, the voice whispered. God help me, he's not human. He's reaching for me, and I can see. I can see through his skin. There are wires underneath. Wires and circuitry, and the transmission cut off abruptly, replaced by dead silence. I sat there for several minutes, waiting to see if the signal would return. I tried calling KC7ABX multiple times, but got no response. I even tried transmitting on different frequencies, thinking maybe he had changed bands, but there was nothing. Finally, I decided to check the FCC database on my phone to see if I could find any information about the call sign KC7ABX. My phone had no signal at all, which wasn't unusual for this remote location, but I made a mental note to look it up when I got back to civilization. I packed up my radio equipment and got back on the road, but I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd heard. The transmission had seemed completely real. The voice, the technical details, even the call sign format were all consistent with a genuine amateur radio emergency transmission. But the location and time discrepancies made no sense. When I reached an area with cell phone coverage about an hour later, I pulled over and looked up the call sign KC7ABX in the FCC database. What I found made my hands shake. The call sign had been issued to a 23-year-old man named Michael Castellanos from Carson City, Nevada. According to the database, his license had been marked as Silent Key, amateur radio terminology for deceased, on July 16, 2018. The date was exactly 1 day after the date mentioned in the transmission I'd heard. I did some more research when I got home and found a news article from July 2018 about a missing person case. Michael Castellanos had disappeared while driving from Carson City to Denver, last seen at a gas station near the Nevada-Utah border. His car was found 3 days later at a rest stop on Highway 50, near mile marker 112. The vehicle appeared to have suffered a radiator failure, and there were signs that he had tried to flag down passing motorists for help. Michael's body was never found. The case remained open for 2 years before being classified as a presumed death due to exposure in the harsh desert environment. I've driven that stretch of Highway 50 several more times since then, but I've never stopped at that rest area again. I've also never heard another transmission on that frequency, despite monitoring it regularly. Sometimes I wonder if Michael is still out there, trapped somehow in that moment of desperation, endlessly calling for help that never comes. Other times I try to convince myself that it was just an elaborate hoax or some kind of atmospheric anomaly that allowed me to receive an old recording. But I keep thinking about what he said at the end of that transmission, about the man from the pickup truck who wasn't quite human. Because when I think back to that night, I realize that as I was driving away from the rest stop, I did see headlights in my rearview mirror. A pickup truck had pulled into the rest area just as I was leaving. I never got a good look at the driver, but something about the way the truck moved, too smooth, too precise, reminded me of Michael's description. And for just a moment, in the brief illumination of my taillights, I thought I saw a figure standing next to the truck, watching me leave. A figure that didn't move quite like a human should. My name is Eleanor, and my husband Frank and I had been looking forward to our retirement road trip for years. After 43 years of marriage and decades of working demanding jobs, we finally had the time and freedom to explore the country at our own pace. We'd bought a comfortable RV and planned an ambitious 3-month journey that would take us from our home in Portland, Oregon, to the East Coast and back, hitting all the national parks and scenic routes we'd always talked about visiting but never had time for. It was our 3rd week on the road when we encountered something that still haunts both of us. We were driving through Montana on Highway 2, that beautiful stretch of road that runs parallel to the Canadian border through some of the most remote and pristine wilderness in the lower 48 states. The scenery was breathtaking. Endless rolling hills covered in golden grass, distant mountain ranges, and a sky so vast and blue it almost hurt to look at. We'd been driving since early morning, and by late afternoon we were ready for a break. Frank was getting tired behind the wheel, and I was eager to stretch my legs and maybe take some photographs of the spectacular landscape. When we saw signs for a rest area ahead, we decided it would be the perfect place to stop, have some coffee from our thermos, and enjoy the scenery before continuing on to our planned overnight stop in Havre. The rest area was typical for rural Montana. A single brick building housing restrooms and a small visitor information center, surrounded by several picnic tables and a parking area large enough for maybe 20 vehicles. It was situated on a slight rise that offered panoramic views of the surrounding countryside, with the Rocky Mountains visible as a purple smudge on the western horizon. When we pulled in, there were already several other vehicles in the parking area, a mix of cars, SUVs, and pickup trucks with license plates from various states. It was busier than I'd expected for such a remote location. But I figured other travelers had the same idea we did about taking advantage of the beautiful late afternoon light and spectacular views. Frank parked our RV in one of the designated spaces, and we both got out to stretch our legs. The air was crisp and clean, with that thin quality you get at high altitude, and there was just enough of a breeze to make the temperature perfect. I grabbed my camera and started taking pictures of the landscape while Frank walked around the RV to check our tires and hitch connections. That's when I started noticing something odd about the other people at the rest stop. There were maybe a dozen people scattered around the area, some sitting at picnic tables, others standing near their vehicles, a few walking slowly around the perimeter of the parking lot. At first glance, they looked like typical tourists and travelers, dressed in casual clothes appropriate for a day of driving through Montana. But as I watched them through my camera viewfinder, I realized they were all doing the same thing. They were watching us, not obviously staring, but definitely keeping us under observation. Every person in that rest area had positioned themselves so they had a clear line of sight to our RV, and whenever Frank or I moved, their attention would subtly shift to track our movements. They weren't talking to each other or interacting in any way, but there was something coordinated about their positioning that made me uncomfortable. I lowered my camera and took a closer look. There was a middle-aged woman in a blue windbreaker sitting at a picnic table about 30 feet away, pretending to read a book, but her eyes kept flicking up to watch us. Near the information kiosk, a man in hiking gear was studying the posted maps with unusual intensity, but I could see his head turning slightly to keep us in his peripheral vision. By the restroom building, an elderly couple was having what appeared to be a quiet conversation, but they were both facing in our direction. "Frank," I called softly to my husband, who was still inspecting our RV. "Do you notice anything strange about the other people here?" He straightened up and looked around the rest area with the careful attention of someone who'd spent 30 years as a high school principal. trained to notice when something wasn't quite right with a group of people. "They're all watching us," he said quietly after a moment. "But they're trying not to make it obvious." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "Should we leave?" Frank considered this for a moment, looking at our fuel gauge and checking his watch. "Let's use the facilities first," he said. "But let's stick together and be ready to go quickly if we need to." We walked toward the restroom building together, and I could feel multiple sets of eyes tracking our movement. The woman with the book didn't turn a page the entire time we were walking. The man at the information kiosk had been studying the same map for at least 10 minutes without moving. The elderly couple's conversation had stopped completely, and they were now openly watching us. The restrooms were clean and well maintained, but I noticed something unsettling when I was washing my hands. Through the small window above the sink, I could see the parking area, and I realized that several of the vehicles had moved. Not drastically, but enough that what had been random parking had become something more deliberate. The cars and trucks were now positioned in a rough semicircle around our RV, blocking most of the obvious exit routes. When I came out of the restroom, Frank was waiting for me with a grim expression. "We need to go," he said quietly. "Now." "What happened?" "I tried to start a conversation with the guy at the information board," Frank said as we walked quickly back toward our RV. Asked him where he was headed, typical traveler small talk. He just stared at me for, about 10 seconds without saying anything, then turned back to the map. It was like he didn't understand what I was asking. As we approached our RV, I noticed that the group of watchers had shifted position again. They were no longer trying to be subtle about their surveillance. The woman with the book had closed it and was now sitting facing us directly. The man at the information kiosk had abandoned all pretense of reading the maps and was standing with his arms crossed, watching our every move. The elderly couple had moved to a position where they were blocking the most direct route to the rest area exit. "Frank," I whispered, "they've moved their cars. Look at the parking arrangement." He glanced around, and I saw his jaw tighten. Our RV was now effectively surrounded, with other vehicles positioned to make it difficult or impossible for us to leave without having to navigate around multiple obstacles. "Get in," he said, his voice calm but urgent. "We're going to back out slowly and see what happens." I climbed into the passenger seat while Frank started the engine. The diesel motor turned over with its usual reliable rumble, but I noticed that several of the watchers had moved even closer to our RV. They still weren't talking to each other or showing any obvious signs of coordination, but their movements were clearly synchronized. Frank put the RV in reverse and began backing out of our parking space carefully. Immediately, I heard the sound of another engine starting. One of the cars that had been blocking our exit route began moving, but instead of getting out of our way, it positioned itself directly behind us. "There's a car behind us," I told Frank, looking in the passenger side mirror. "I see it," he said grimly. "Hold on." He stopped backing up and shifted into drive, planning to pull forward and try a different exit route. But as soon as we started moving forward, another vehicle, a pickup truck that had been parked to our left, suddenly developed what appeared to be engine trouble. The driver got out and lifted the hood, effectively blocking that exit route as well. "Frank, this is too coordinated to be a coincidence," I said, my voice rising with panic. "I know," he replied, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. "These people are working together." We sat there for a moment, engine idling, trying to figure out our next move. The watchers had now completely abandoned any pretense of being casual tourists. They were all standing in clear view, facing our RV, absolutely motionless. There were more of them than I'd initially counted. At least 15 people spread around the rest area, all focused on us with an intensity that was truly frightening. The woman who had been pretending to read walked slowly toward our RV and positioned herself directly in front of us, about 10 feet from our bumper. She didn't say anything or make any threatening gestures. She just stood there, staring at us through the windshield with an expression that was completely blank. "What do they want?" I whispered. "I don't know," Frank said. "But we're not staying to find out." He revved the engine and began moving forward slowly, hoping the woman would move out of our way. She didn't. She stood perfectly still as our RV approached, showing no sign of self-preservation or concern. Frank had to stop just a few feet from her to avoid running her down. The moment we stopped, all of the watchers began moving toward us in perfect unison. They walked at the same pace, maintained the same spacing between each other, and showed the same emotionless expressions. It was like watching a coordinated military maneuver, except these were supposedly random tourists at a rest stop. "Frank, go," I said urgently. "Just go around her. Drive on the grass if you have to." Frank turned the wheel hard to the right and drove our RV off the pavement and onto the grass area beside the parking lot. The big rig handled the rough terrain reasonably well, but the watchers immediately adjusted their positions to intercept our new route. They moved with mechanical precision, always staying just far enough ahead of us to block our path without actually putting themselves in immediate danger. We spent the next 10 minutes in a bizarre, slow-speed chase around the rest area, with Frank trying every possible exit route while the watchers repositioned themselves to block us at every turn. They never spoke, never showed any emotion, never broke formation. It was like being trapped by a group of human chess pieces that could anticipate our every move. Finally, Frank found a gap between two of the watchers and gunned the engine, pushing our RV to its maximum speed across the grass and toward the entrance ramp. Several of the watchers ran to intercept us, but they couldn't match the speed of our diesel engine, and we managed to reach the pavement and merge back onto Highway 2. I looked back through our rear window as we pulled away from the rest area. The watchers had all stopped running and were now standing in a perfect line along the edge of the parking lot, facing the highway. They remained motionless as we drove away, growing smaller in the distance, but never breaking their formation. We drove for 2 hours without stopping, not talking much, both of us trying to process what had just happened. When we finally pulled into a truck stop in Havre, Frank's hands were still shaking as he turned off the engine. We called the Montana State Police and tried to report the incident. But what could we tell them? That a group of people at a rest stop had watched us and moved their cars in a way that made us uncomfortable. No laws had been broken. No threats had been made. No one had actually tried to harm us. The dispatcher was polite, but clearly skeptical. She took our names and contact information and said she'd have a trooper check on the rest area. But I could tell she thought we were just a couple of paranoid, elderly tourists. We never found out what those people wanted or why they had targeted us. We finished our road trip, but we never stopped at another remote rest area, and we never drove Highway 2 through Montana again. Sometimes I wake up at night thinking about those blank, emotionless faces and the mechanical precision of their movements. Frank says they were probably just a group of criminals working together to rob travelers. But that doesn't explain their strange behavior or why they never actually tried to take anything from us. Whatever they were, whatever they wanted, I'm grateful we managed to get away from them. And I'll never forget the sight of them standing in that perfect line, watching us disappear down the highway, waiting for the next travelers to fall into their trap. My name is Karim, and I travel constantly for work as a regional sales manager for a medical equipment company. My territory covers most of the southeastern United States, which means I spend roughly 200 days a year on the road, driving from hospital to clinic to medical center. After 15 years of this routine, I thought I'd seen every rest stop, truck stop, and roadside facility from Virginia to Florida. I was wrong. This happened in September of 2023, on what should have been a routine drive from Charlotte to Savannah. I'd made this particular trip dozens of times before, usually taking I-95 south through South Carolina because it's the most direct route. The drive normally takes about 4.5 hours, and I'd gotten into the habit of stopping at the same rest area near the North Carolina-South Carolina border to grab coffee and use the facilities. I'd left Charlotte around 3 p.m. after a successful presentation at Presbyterian Hospital, feeling good about a potential contract that could be worth significant commission. The weather was perfect for driving. Sunny, but not too hot, with just enough breeze to make the September afternoon comfortable. Traffic was light for a weekday, and I was making good time down I-95. Around 5:30, just as the sun was starting to get low in the sky, I felt the familiar pressure that told me I needed to make a pit stop. I'd been drinking coffee steadily throughout the day, and my bladder was reaching its limit. I knew there was a rest area coming up in about 10 miles, so I started looking for the familiar blue signs with the white symbols indicating restrooms and parking. When I saw the rest area sign, I took the exit and followed the ramp down to what looked like a standard South Carolina Department of Transportation facility. The building was the typical brick construction with large windows and the institutional architecture you see at highway rest stops throughout the state. The parking lot was about half full with the usual mix of cars, SUVs, and a few tractor trailers parked in the designated truck area. I parked near the main entrance and walked quickly toward the building, eager to take care of business and get back on the road. I wanted to reach my hotel in Savannah before dark, and I still had about 2 hours of driving ahead of me. The exterior of the building looked completely normal, but the moment I pushed through the glass doors, I knew something was wrong. The interior was much larger than it should have been based on the building's external dimensions. Instead of the compact layout typical of highway rest stops, I found myself in what appeared to be a spacious lobby with multiple corridors branching off in different directions. The lighting was different too. Not the harsh fluorescent illumination you'd expect, but softer, more diffuse lighting that seemed to come from panels built into the ceiling. The walls were painted in soothing earth tones rather than the institutional beige or green you usually see in public facilities. There was even background music playing, something instrumental and vaguely classical that reminded me of what you might hear in an upscale hotel lobby. I stood there for a moment, disoriented and confused. This definitely wasn't the rest stop I'd been expecting. But my bladder was making urgent demands, so I looked around for signs pointing to the restrooms. That's when I noticed the other people in the lobby. There were maybe a dozen other visitors scattered around the space, but they weren't behaving like typical rest stop users. Instead of hurrying to the facilities or grabbing snacks from vending machines, they were moving slowly and deliberately, almost like they were exploring the space with careful attention to detail. Some were reading informational displays mounted on the walls. Others were sitting in comfortable-looking chairs that seemed out of place in a highway rest area. I approached one of the wall displays, thinking it might have a facility map or directory that would help me find the restrooms. but instead of the usual tourist information about local attractions or highway conditions. The display contained detailed information about something called the Interstate Wellness Initiative and featured photographs of smiling families engaged in various recreational activities. The text was professionally designed and laid out like a corporate brochure, but the content didn't make much sense. It talked about optimized traveler experiences and enhanced journey outcomes, using language that sounded like marketing copy, but didn't actually convey any useful information. I looked around for more conventional signage and finally spotted what appeared to be a directory mounted on a pillar in the center of the lobby. According to the directory, the restrooms were located down the corridor marked Level 1, Primary Services. There were also listings for Level 2, Extended Amenities, and Level 3, Specialized Programs, which struck me as unusually elaborate for a highway rest stop. I headed down the Level 1 corridor, which was wider and longer than seemed possible given the building's exterior dimensions. The walls were lined with more informational displays, all featuring the same professional design and vaguely corporate messaging about traveler wellness and journey optimization. There were also doors leading to what appeared to be additional rooms or facilities, each marked with cryptic labels like Consultation Suite A and Assessment Center 1. The restroom, when I finally found it, was unlike any public facility I'd ever seen. Instead of the utilitarian fixtures and industrial materials typical of highway rest stops, it featured high-end finishes that would have been at home in a luxury hotel. The lighting was warm and flattering, the fixtures were polished chrome and marble, and there was even classical music playing softly from hidden speakers. But here's where things got really strange. The restroom was much larger than it needed to be. In addition to the usual stalls and urinals, there were additional areas that seemed to serve no clear purpose. Alcoves with comfortable seating, a section with what looked like massage chairs, and even a small area with vending machines offering items I'd never seen before, like energy optimization supplements and cognitive enhancement beverages. I took care of my immediate needs and started to leave, but found myself confused about which direction led back to the main lobby. The corridor I'd entered from seemed to have split into multiple branches while I was in the restroom, and I couldn't remember which one I'd come from. I chose the corridor that seemed most familiar and started walking. But after a few minutes, I realized I was in a completely different part of the facility. This corridor was lined with doors leading to rooms marked with labels like Individual Assessment, Group Processing, and Exit Interview. Through the small windows in some of the doors, I could see what appeared to be office spaces with desks, chairs, and computer equipment. I tried backtracking, but somehow ended up in yet another corridor I didn't recognize. This one had doors marked with numbers rather than descriptive labels. Room 101, Room 102, and so on. The lighting here was slightly different, more clinical, and the background music had changed to something that sounded like nature sounds mixed with very low-frequency tones that I felt more than heard. I started to feel genuinely panicked. This was supposed to be a simple rest stop visit, but I'd somehow gotten lost in what appeared to be an enormous facility with multiple levels and dozens of rooms. I checked my phone for the time and was shocked to see that I'd been inside the building for over an hour, even though it felt like maybe 15 minutes. I tried calling for help, but my voice seemed to be absorbed by the soft surfaces and background audio in a way that made it feel like I was shouting into a pillow. There was no echo, no sense that my voice was carrying any distance at all. That's when I started hearing other voices. They were faint and seemed to be coming from behind the numbered doors. I couldn't make out specific words, but the tone suggested conversations or interviews taking place. Some voices sounded calm and professional, like customer service representatives or medical staff. Others sounded confused or distressed, like people who were lost or didn't understand what was happening to them. I pressed my ear against the door of room 105 and could hear what sounded like a man explaining his travel plans to someone who was asking increasingly detailed questions about his destination, his reasons for traveling, and his personal background. The questions started innocuously enough, but gradually became more invasive and personal. At room 108, I heard a woman's voice saying something about not understanding why she couldn't leave, and asking repeatedly when she would be allowed to return to her car. A calm, professional voice was explaining something about processing procedures and completion requirements, in the kind of soothing tone you might hear from a therapist or counselor. I backed away from the doors and tried to find an exit, any exit, that would get me out of this impossible maze of corridors and rooms. I walked for what felt like hours, passing more numbered doors, more assessment centers, more consultation suites. Occasionally, I would encounter other lost visitors wandering the corridors with the same confused, slightly panicked expressions I was probably wearing. I tried talking to a few of them, but they all seemed to be in a daze, like they were only partially aware of their surroundings. One man told me he'd been looking for the exit for 3 days, but kept finding new corridors he hadn't explored yet. A woman said she'd come in to use the restroom, and somehow ended up in what she described as a medical examination room, where staff members had asked her to fill out extensive paperwork about her health history and travel patterns. Finally, after what my phone showed as nearly 4 hours inside the facility, I found a corridor that led to what looked like the original lobby. But even this space seemed different, larger than I remembered, with different displays on the walls and furniture arranged in a different configuration. I rushed toward what I hoped was the exit, pushing through glass doors that looked identical to the ones I'd entered through hours earlier. But instead of emerging into the parking lot where I'd left my car, I found myself in a completely different outdoor area. A landscaped courtyard with benches, fountains, and walking paths that definitely hadn't been there when I arrived. I could see the highway in the distance and the sound of traffic, but there was no direct path from this courtyard to the parking area where I'd left my car. I walked around the perimeter of the courtyard, looking for a way back to the original entrance, and eventually found a pathway that led around the building to the familiar parking lot. My car was exactly where I'd left it, and according to my dashboard clock, only about 20 minutes had passed since I'd parked. But my phone showed that I'd been inside the facility for over 4 hours, and the sun had moved considerably across the sky. I drove away as quickly as possible, not stopping until I reached my hotel in Savannah 3 hours later. The next day, I tried to find information about the rest stop online, but searches for facilities at that location only turned up standard South Carolina DOT rest areas with basic amenities, nothing matching the elaborate facility I'd encountered. I've driven that same route dozens of times since then, but I've never seen that rest stop again. The exit I took still exists, but it leads to a different facility, a conventional rest area with the standard brick building, basic restrooms, and vending machines you'd expect. I still don't know what that place was or what those assessment centers and consultation suites were designed for. But I think about those other voices I heard behind the numbered doors, and I wonder how many other travelers have gotten lost in that impossible maze of corridors and rooms. And sometimes, late at night when I'm driving through unfamiliar territory, I catch myself checking the exit numbers extra carefully, making sure I don't accidentally take the wrong ramp and end up back in that place where the building is bigger on the inside than the outside, and where some visitors apparently never find their way back to their cars. My name is Rohan, and I've been working as a traveling salesman for the past 22 years, covering a territory that stretches across Kansas, Nebraska, and eastern Colorado. I drive the same route so often that I know every mile marker, every exit, every rest stop and gas station along the way. My job requires precision and reliability. I have to maintain relationships with dozens of clients spread across hundreds of miles. And that means being on the road almost constantly and knowing exactly where I am and how long it takes to get anywhere. That's why what happened to me on Interstate 70 in Kansas is so disturbing. I know that stretch of highway like the back of my hand. I've driven it at least twice a month for over 2 decades. Every landmark, every facility, every service area is burned into my memory from years of repetition. But sometime in early 2024, something appeared there that had never existed before, and it's been messing with my head ever since. I first noticed it on a Tuesday morning in March, driving westbound from Kansas City toward Denver for a series of client meetings. I'd made this exact drive hundreds of times before, always stopping at the same familiar rest areas and gas stations to break up the long hours behind the wheel. The landscape along I-70 through Kansas is pretty monotonous. Endless wheat fields, scattered farmhouses, and the occasional small town. So I tend to navigate more by mile markers and familiar landmarks than by actually paying attention to the scenery. Around mile marker 237, just west of Hayes, I noticed a rest area that I'd never seen before. This struck me as strange immediately, because I knew this section of highway intimately. I'd driven past mile marker 237 literally hundreds of times, and there had never been a rest facility there. The closest rest area was supposed to be about 15 miles further west, near Ellis. But there it was, a standard-looking Kansas Department of Transportation rest stop with the familiar brown brick building, picnic tables, and the usual informational displays about local history and tourism. There was even a sign indicating restrooms, vending machines, and pet walking areas, just like every other rest stop on the interstate system. I needed a break anyway, so I decided to pull in and check it out. Maybe it was a new facility that had been constructed recently, and I just hadn't noticed it during my previous trips. Construction along major highways happens all the time, and it's possible I'd been distracted during previous drives and missed the opening of a new rest area. The facility appeared completely normal and well-maintained. The parking lot was clean, the building looked recently constructed, and the landscaping was neat and professional. There were a few other vehicles in the parking area, a couple of cars with out-of-state plates, a pickup truck, and an RV. Nothing unusual about the mix of travelers you'd expect to see at any highway rest stop. I used the restroom, grabbed a soda from the vending machine, and spent a few minutes reading the informational displays. They contained the typical content you'd find at any Kansas rest area. Information about local agricultural history, prairie wildlife, and nearby attractions. Everything seemed perfectly legitimate and properly maintained. But when I got back in my car and checked the time, something weird had happened. According to my dashboard clock, I'd been at the rest stop for about 15 minutes. But my cell phone showed a different time. According to it, I'd been there for almost an hour. I figured one of my clocks was wrong and didn't think much of it at the time. I continued on to Denver, completed my business meetings, and drove back toward Kansas City a few days later. When I passed mile marker 237 on the return trip, the rest area was still there, looking exactly the same as it had a few days earlier. Again, I stopped for a break, and again, I experienced the time discrepancy. My dashboard and phone showed different amounts of elapsed time for my visit. This happened every time I drove that route over the next few months. The rest area was always there at mile marker 237, always looked the same, always seemed to function normally. But the time inconsistencies continued, and I started paying closer attention to other details that didn't seem quite right. For one thing, I began recognizing some of the other people who stopped there. On multiple trips, spread weeks apart, I would see the same individuals. A woman in a red jacket who always sat at the same picnic table. An elderly man who always seemed to be walking the same small dog around the pet area. A family with 2 young children who were always eating lunch at table closest to the building. At first I thought this might just be coincidence. Maybe these were local people who used the rest area regularly, or other traveling salespeople like myself who happened to have similar schedules. But the repetition was too exact, too precise. These people were always doing exactly the same things, wearing exactly the same clothes, even eating what appeared to be exactly the same meals. The woman in the red jacket was always reading the same page of the same magazine. The elderly man's dog always stopped to sniff the same bush at the same point during their walk. The family always had the same conversation about their travel plans, with the father looking at the same road atlas and the mother organizing the same items in their cooler. I started keeping a log of my stops at the rest area, noting the date, time, and the people I observed there. The pattern was undeniable. I was seeing the same people doing the same things every single time I stopped, regardless of whether my visits were days or weeks apart. But the most disturbing discovery came when I tried to research the rest area online. According to the Kansas Department of Transportation website, there was no rest facility at mile marker 237. The official highway maps showed the same thing. No rest area between the facilities near Hayes and Ellis. When I called KDOT directly to ask about it, they insisted that no such facility existed and suggested I might be confusing it with one of the other rest areas along Interstate 70. I even tried using GPS mapping services to locate the rest area, but none of them showed a facility at that location. According to every official source I could find, mile marker 237 was just an empty stretch of highway through rural Kansas farmland. Yet every time I drove that route, the rest area was there, solid and real and apparently functional. I could walk around it, use the facilities, buy sodas from the vending machines. Other travelers were clearly using it too, based on the occupied parking spaces and the people I saw there regularly. The time distortions continued to get worse. What felt like a 10-minute stop would show as 2 hours on my phone, or sometimes the reverse. Spending what felt like an hour at the facility would register as only a few minutes of elapsed time. I started setting multiple timers and alarms on different devices to try to track the discrepancies. But the results were inconsistent and confusing. On one occasion, I arrived at the rest area around 2 p.m., according to all my devices, spent what felt like a normal 20-minute break, and discovered when I returned to my car that my dashboard clock showed 2:20 p.m. while my phone displayed 11:30 a.m. The phone was showing a time earlier than when I had arrived, which should have been impossible. I began taking photographs during my stops, thinking I could use them to document the facility and maybe figure out what was going on. But when I reviewed the photos later, they showed inconsistent results. Sometimes the images looked normal, standard rest area photographs showing the building, parking lot, and other visitors. Other times the photos were distorted or showed things that didn't match my memories of the visit. In one series of photos taken during a single stop, the building appeared to be different sizes and configurations. One image showed the standard single-story brick structure I was familiar with, while another taken just minutes later showed what appeared to be a much larger, multi-story facility. A third photo showed the building from the same angle, but with completely different architectural details and landscaping. The people in my photographs were even more disturbing. The woman in the red jacket appeared in dozens of my photos taken over several months, but she never appeared to age or change in any way. She was always sitting in exactly the same position, reading the same magazine, wearing identical clothes. Even more strangely, in some photos she appeared solid and normal, while in others she seemed translucent or partially faded, like a double-exposed image. I tried approaching some of these familiar people during my stops, thinking I could ask them about their experiences or find out if they had noticed anything unusual about the rest area. But whenever I tried to initiate a conversation, they would respond in ways that suggested they didn't remember our previous encounters. The woman in the red jacket would look up from her magazine with a polite but blank expression, as if she had never seen me before. The elderly man walking his dog would nod and smile, but give no indication that we had crossed paths dozens of times before. More troubling was their behavior when I tried to engage them in any meaningful conversation. They would respond to simple pleasantries and basic questions, but if I asked anything specific about their travel plans, where they were coming from, or how often they used this rest area, their responses became vague and repetitive. It was like talking to actors who had learned their lines for casual small talk but couldn't improvise beyond their scripted interactions. The breaking point came during a stop in November 2024. I had arrived at the rest area around dusk, and as I was walking back to my car after using the facilities, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Parked in the same space where I always saw the pickup truck was my own car, the exact same make, model, color, and license plate number as the vehicle I was walking toward. I stood there for several minutes, looking back and forth between the two identical cars, trying to process what I was seeing. Both vehicles were perfect duplicates, right down to the small dent in the rear bumper and the faded parking permit hanging from the rearview mirror. I checked my key fob, and it unlocked both cars simultaneously. I got in what I thought was my car and drove away as quickly as possible. But the experience left me deeply shaken. When I looked in my rearview mirror as I was leaving the rest area, I could see the duplicate vehicle still parked there, exactly where I had found it. Since then, I've tried avoiding the rest area at mile marker 237, but it's not always possible. Sometimes when I'm driving that route, I find myself pulling into the facility without consciously deciding to stop, as if my car is following some kind of predetermined path. Other times, I'll deliberately drive past, only to discover that I'm somehow sitting in the parking lot with no memory of taking the exit. I've started documenting everything, keeping detailed logs of my travels, taking GPS readings, recording video during my drives through that section of highway. But the evidence is inconsistent and confusing. Sometimes the rest area shows up in my documentation, sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes my devices record normal travel times through that area, sometimes they show impossible temporal anomalies. The most recent incident happened just last month. I was driving the route during a snowstorm, and visibility was poor enough that I almost missed the exit for mile marker 237. But as I passed the location where the rest area should be, I caught a glimpse of something through the swirling snow. For just a moment, I could see the familiar building and parking lot, but they appeared to be overlaid with images of empty farmland, like two photographs printed on top of each other. I pulled over at the next exit and called my wife, trying to explain what I'd been experiencing over the past year. She listened patiently, but suggested I should see a doctor, maybe get checked for stress or fatigue-related issues. She's probably right. But I know what I've seen and experienced. I still drive I-70 through Kansas regularly for work, and the rest area is still there at mile marker 237. I still see the same people doing the same things, and I still experience the time distortions and impossible coincidences. I've learned to expect it now, but I haven't learned to understand it. Sometimes I wonder if I'm trapped in the same kind of loop as the other people I see there. Endlessly repeating the same actions, the same conversations, the same routine stops along a highway that exists in some space between reality and something else entirely. My name is Jessica, and I've always considered myself a pretty independent person. At 24, I'd driven cross-country by myself twice, backpacked through Europe alone for 3 months, and never really felt unsafe or vulnerable in unfamiliar situations. I pride myself on being smart about personal safety and trusting my instincts when something doesn't feel right. But what happened to me at a rest stop in West Texas taught me that sometimes even the most careful precautions aren't enough. This was back in August of 2023, when I was driving from Los Angeles back to my hometown in North Carolina after finishing graduate school at UCLA. I decided to make the drive alone as a kind of personal celebration, a solo road trip to mark the transition between my student years and starting my career. I'd planned the route carefully, booking hotels in advance and timing my drives to avoid being on the road late at night in unfamiliar areas. But sometimes plans don't work out the way you expect them to. I'd gotten a late start leaving El Paso that morning due to car trouble, a slow leak in one of my tires that required a stop at a service station and a longer than expected wait for repairs. By the time I was back on I-10 heading east, it was already past noon, and I knew I'd be driving later into the evening than I'd originally planned. The drive across West Texas is long and monotonous under the best circumstances, but doing it alone with the pressure of making up lost time made it even more tedious. Mile after mile of empty desert landscape, broken up only by the occasional truck stop or tiny town. The sun was setting by the time I reached the stretch between Fort Stockton and Junction, and I was starting to feel the fatigue that comes from driving all day. Around 10 p.m., I realized I desperately needed a break. I'd been pushing myself to make good time, surviving on gas station coffee and energy bars. But my concentration was starting to slip, and I was having trouble staying focused on the road. When I saw signs for a 24-hour rest stop ahead, I decided it would be smart to pull over, stretch my legs, grab some proper food, and maybe take a short nap in my car before continuing. The rest stop was one of those larger commercial facilities that catered to long-haul truckers as well as regular travelers. Multiple buildings with a restaurant, convenience store, fuel pumps, and shower facilities. There were quite a few vehicles in the parking lot despite the late hour, which made me feel safer about stopping. Plenty of people around, well-lit area, and the kind of busy, commercial atmosphere that usually discourages trouble. I parked near the main building and went inside to use the restroom and buy some real food. The convenience store was typical for this type of facility. Aisles of snacks, drinks, and travel supplies, along with a small selection of hot food items under heat lamps. There were several other customers browsing around, mostly truckers and other late-night travelers like myself. The person behind the counter appeared to be some kind of manager or supervisor, rather than a regular cashier. He was a man in his 40s, wearing a polo shirt with the facility's logo, and a name tag that identified him as Bill Night Manager. He seemed friendly and professional when I paid for my sandwich and drink, making the kind of small talk you'd expect from someone in a customer service role. "Long drive tonight?" he asked as he rang up my purchases. "Yeah, trying to make it to San Antonio," I replied, which was true. I had a hotel reservation there for the night. "That's still a couple hours from here," he said. "You sure you're not too tired? We get a lot of accidents on this stretch when people push themselves too hard." I appreciated the concern, even though it seemed a bit forward for casual conversation with a customer. "I'll be fine," I said. "Just needed to grab some food and stretch my legs." "Well, be careful out there," he said, handing me my receipt. "It gets pretty desolate between here and San Antonio, especially this late at night." I thanked him and headed back outside to eat my food in my car before getting back on the road. The parking lot was still busy, with trucks coming and going regularly, and I felt comfortable sitting there for a while to eat and rest. That's when I noticed Bill, the night manager, had followed me outside. He wasn't being obvious about it, but I could see him through my rearview mirror, standing near the building entrance and looking in my direction. When I turned around to look directly at him, he would glance away or pretend to be busy with something else, but I could tell his attention kept returning to me and my car. This made me slightly uncomfortable, but I tried to rationalize it. Maybe he was just being conscientious about security, keeping an eye on the parking lot and the customers. Maybe he'd had problems with people loitering or causing trouble, and he was just making sure everything stayed peaceful. But as I continued eating, I noticed he was gradually moving closer to my car. Not in a direct line, but in a casual, wandering pattern that slowly brought him nearer to where I was parked. He would stop and talk to truckers, or appear to check on something near the fuel pumps, but always in a way that brought him a few steps closer to my location. I finished my food quickly and decided it was time to get back on the road. But when I tried to start my car, nothing happened. The engine turned over normally, but it wouldn't catch and start running. I tried several times, but got the same result. The starter was working, but the engine wouldn't fire. That's when Bill appeared at my driver's side window. "Having some trouble?" he asked with what seemed like genuine concern. I rolled down the window partway. "The engine won't start," I said. "It was running fine when I got here." "Pop the hood," he said. "Let me take a look. I know a bit about cars." I hesitated for a moment, but I was genuinely stuck and needed help. I pulled the hood release and got out of the car to watch as he examined the engine bay with a small flashlight. "I think I see the problem," he said after a few minutes. "Looks like your battery cable came loose. Probably just vibrated loose from all the highway driving." He showed me what he was talking about, pointing to a cable that had apparently disconnected from the battery terminal. It seemed plausible. These things happen, especially on older cars like mine. "I can fix this for you," he said, pulling some tools from his pocket. "Just take a minute to tighten it back up." While he worked on the car, he started asking questions that made me increasingly uncomfortable. "So, you're driving to San Antonio tonight?" he asked. "You got family there?" "Just passing through," I said vaguely. "Long trip by yourself," he commented. "You must be pretty brave, driving alone through this part of Texas. Not many young ladies would attempt that." There was something about the way he said, "young ladies," that set off alarm bells in my head. The tone was condescending and slightly predatory, like he was commenting on my vulnerability rather than expressing admiration for my independence. "Where did you say you were coming from?" he continued as he worked. "I didn't say," I replied, trying to keep my voice polite but firm. "California plates," he observed, glancing at my license plate. "Long way from home. You got somewhere to stay tonight, or are you planning to drive straight through?" I didn't answer this question. Something about his persistence in asking personal details about my travel plans was making me very nervous. These weren't the kind of casual questions you'd expect from someone just making conversation while helping with car trouble. There, he said, straightening up and closing the hood. That should do it. Try starting her up now. I got back in the car and turned the key. The engine started immediately, running smoothly as if there had never been any problem at all. Thank you so much, I said through the partially open window. I really appreciate the help. No problem at all, he replied. But instead of stepping back to let me leave, he moved closer to the car. You know, I'm a little concerned about you driving alone this late at night. This stretch of highway can be dangerous for a young woman by herself. I'll be fine, I said, putting the car in reverse. Thanks again for your help. But he didn't move away from the car. Instead, he leaned down closer to my window, close enough that I could smell coffee and cigarettes on his breath. The thing is, he said, his voice taking on a different tone, less helpful, more insistent. I've been watching you since you got here, and I can tell you're nervous. Maybe a little scared. That's not safe when you're driving alone at night. I felt a chill run down my spine. I need to get going, I said firmly, hoping he would take the hint and step away from the car. You know what I think? He continued, completely ignoring my attempt to end the conversation. I think you should stay here tonight. We've got a driver's lounge with cots, real secure, and I could keep an eye on you, make sure nothing happens. The way he said, keep an eye on you, made my skin crawl. This was definitely not a genuine offer of assistance. This was something else entirely. That's very kind. But I really need to go, I said, my voice getting sharper with anxiety. The thing is, he said. Now his tone was becoming openly threatening. I don't think your car is going to make it very far. That battery cable I fixed? It's going to come loose again real soon. Probably within the next few miles. I stared at him through the window, finally understanding what was happening. He hadn't fixed a loose battery cable. He had disconnected it in the first place. He had deliberately sabotaged my car to create a situation where I would need his help. And now he was threatening to do it again if I didn't comply with his suggestions. I know this area real well, he continued, his hand resting on the roof of my car in a way that made it clear he could prevent me from leaving if he wanted to. Real isolated between here and the next town. If your car breaks down out there, it could be hours before anyone finds you. Dangerous things can happen to a young woman stranded alone on a dark highway. I realized I was in serious trouble. This man had disabled my car, lured me into a vulnerable situation, and was now making it clear that he had no intention of letting me leave safely. The parking lot that had seemed so busy and safe when I arrived now felt isolated and threatening. The other customers and truckers were far away, focused on their own business, and unlikely to notice or intervene in what appeared to be a casual conversation between a helpful manager and a customer. I made a split-second decision. Instead of trying to argue or negotiate with him, I gunned the engine and backed up quickly, forcing him to jump away from the car to avoid being hit. I threw the transmission into drive and floored the accelerator, heading for the parking lot exit as fast as I could safely manage. In my rearview mirror, I could see him standing in the parking lot, watching me leave. He wasn't running after me or showing any sign of panic or surprise. He was just standing there calmly, like this was exactly the outcome he had expected. I drove for the next 2 hours without stopping, checking my mirrors constantly to make sure I wasn't being followed. Every time I saw headlights behind me, my heart would race until the vehicle passed me or turned off at an exit. The car ran perfectly the entire way to San Antonio, with no sign of the battery problems he had threatened. When I finally reached my hotel, I was shaking so badly I could barely hold my key card, steady enough to unlock my room. I called the Texas State Police and reported the incident, giving them the location of the rest stop and a description of the man who had threatened me. The dispatcher took my report seriously and said they would send a trooper to check on the facility, but I never heard back about whether they found anything suspicious. I also called the corporate headquarters of the truck stop chain the next morning and reported what had happened. They claimed to have no employee named Bill working as a night manager at that location, and said they would investigate the incident. Again, I never received any follow-up information. The experience taught me that predators can be incredibly sophisticated in their methods. This wasn't some random criminal who spotted an opportunity. This was someone who had clearly done this before. Someone who knew exactly how to create a situation where a victim would be isolated and vulnerable. If I hadn't trusted my instincts and acted quickly when I realized what was happening, I hate to think about how that night might have ended. I finished my drive to North Carolina without any further incidents. But I never forgot the lesson I learned at that rest stop in West Texas. Sometimes the people who seem most helpful are the ones you need to fear the most. And sometimes the only thing that stands between you and real danger is your willingness to trust your instincts and act on them immediately, even when it means being rude or appearing ungrateful. I still make long solo drives, but I'm much more careful now about when and where I stop, especially late at night in remote areas. And I always trust that little voice in my head that tells me when something isn't right. Even when I can't put my finger on exactly what's bothering me about a situation. My name is Catherine, and I work as a pediatric nurse at a children's hospital in Minneapolis. My job has taught me to be observant and detail-oriented, especially when it comes to families and children. I'm trained to notice things that might be wrong or out of place, whether it's signs of abuse, neglect, or just unusual behavior that might indicate a medical or psychological problem. That training is probably why I paid such close attention to what happened at a rest stop in South Dakota during the summer of 2022, and why I'm still haunted by what I witnessed there. My husband Mark and I were taking our twin 8-year-old boys, Connor and Tyler, on a vacation to see Mount Rushmore in the Badlands. We'd planned the trip as a long weekend getaway, driving from Minneapolis to Rapid City and spending 3 days exploring the Black Hills region. It was the kind of family adventure we'd been looking forward to all summer, and the boys were excited about seeing the famous monuments and learning about Native American history. We left Minneapolis early on a Friday morning in July, planning to make the drive in one day with a few stops along the way to break up the long hours in the car. The weather was perfect for road tripping. Sunny and warm, but not too hot, with clear skies stretching endlessly over the prairie landscape. Traffic was light on I-90 westbound, and we were making good time through southern Minnesota and into South Dakota. Around noon, we stopped for lunch at a large, well-maintained rest area near Mitchell, South Dakota. It was one of those newer facilities that South Dakota has built specifically to accommodate tourist traffic. Spacious parking areas, modern restrooms, picnic pavilions, and informational displays about local attractions. The place was busy with other families and travelers, which created a pleasant, festive atmosphere that reminded me why I love summer road trips. We found a picnic table in partial shade and unpacked the lunch we'd brought from home. Sandwiches, fruit, chips, and juice boxes for the boys. Connor and Tyler were getting antsy from being in the car for several hours, so we let them run around and explore the playground equipment while Mark and I relaxed and enjoyed the break from driving. That's when I noticed the other family. They had arrived shortly after us in a white minivan with Iowa plates, and they were setting up at a picnic table about 50 feet away from ours. There was a father who appeared to be in his late 30s, a mother who looked to be roughly the same age, and 2 children. A boy who seemed to be around 10 years old, and a girl who looked to be maybe 6 or 7. At first, they seemed like a completely normal family doing exactly what we were doing, stopping for lunch and letting their kids burn off some energy during a long drive. The father was unpacking food from a cooler, while the mother was organizing napkins and drinks. The children were standing nearby, waiting patiently for their parents to get everything ready. But something about the scene caught my attention and held it. Maybe it was my professional training kicking in, or maybe it was just parental instinct. But there was something about this family that didn't feel quite right. The children were too still, too quiet, too perfectly well behaved. In my experience, kids who have been cooped up in a car for hours are usually bouncing off the walls when they get a chance to run around. But these children were standing in place like little soldiers waiting for orders. The parents weren't talking to each other or to their children, which also seemed unusual for a family on vacation. Most families I see at rest stops are chattering excitedly about their destination, making plans for the rest of their drive, or dealing with the typical minor crises that come with traveling with kids. Bathroom breaks, spilled drinks, arguments about seating arrangements in the car. But this family was conducting their lunch stop in complete silence. I watched them discreetly while Mark and I ate our own lunch and kept an eye on our boys. The father would place items on the picnic table in a very organized, methodical way. First the sandwiches, then the drinks, then the napkins, then the chips. The mother would hand items to the children in what appeared to be a predetermined sequence. Everything they did seemed choreographed, like they were following a script or performing a routine they had practiced many times before. The children ate their lunch without speaking, without fidgeting, without displaying any of the normal behaviors you'd expect from kids their age. They didn't ask questions, didn't complain about their food, didn't beg to go play on the playground equipment. They just sat there eating in perfect silence, while their parents continued their wordless lunch preparation and cleanup routine. "Mark," I said quietly to my husband, "look at that family over there. Do they seem normal to you?" Mark glanced over at the family I was indicating, observed them for a minute, then shrugged. "They seem fine to me. Maybe they're just tired from driving, or maybe the kids are really well disciplined." But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. In 15 years of working with children and families, I developed a pretty good sense for when family dynamics are healthy and normal versus when something troubling is going on beneath the surface. This family set off every instinctive alarm I had. I continued watching them as we finished our own lunch and started packing up our picnic supplies. The other family completed their meal and began cleaning up with the same methodical precision they had shown during setup. The father packed the cooler while the mother disposed of trash and wiped down the table. The children stood quietly beside the picnic table, waiting for their parents to finish. Then they started walking toward the main rest stop building. This should have been completely normal. Families use rest stop facilities all the time for bathroom breaks, to buy snacks, to stretch their legs, and look at tourist information. But something about the way this family moved bothered me intensely. They walked in a perfectly straight line with the father in front, followed by the mother, then the two children. Their spacing was exactly even, their pace was identical, and none of them looked around or deviated from their path in any way. It reminded me of a military formation or a funeral procession. Formal, rigid, and completely unnatural for a family with young children. I found myself getting up from our picnic table and following them at a distance, telling Mark I wanted to use the restroom before we got back on the road. But really, I was compelled to keep watching this family because everything about their behavior was triggering my professional instincts about situations where children might be in danger. I watched them walk across the parking lot, maintaining their perfect formation, heading directly toward the main building that housed the restrooms and visitor information center. They never wavered from their straight-line path, never paused to look at anything, never interacted with each other or with any of the other people in the area. But here's the thing that still gives me nightmares. They never made it to the building. I was maybe 30 feet behind them, walking at a normal pace while they maintained their mechanical march toward the facilities. There were dozens of other people in the area, families with children, elderly couples, truckers, tourists, all moving around the rest stop in the typical casual patterns you'd expect. The parking lot was busy, but not crowded, and visibility was excellent under the bright afternoon sun. The family was about 20 feet from the entrance to the main building when they simply vanished. I don't mean they went inside the building or walked around to a different entrance or got distracted and changed direction. I mean they disappeared completely, instantaneously in broad daylight, with clear lines of sight in all directions. 1 second I could see all 4 of them walking in their rigid formation toward the building entrance. I blinked, and they were gone. Not inside the building, not behind another vehicle, not around a corner. Completely gone, as if they had never existed at all. I stood there in shock for several minutes, looking around frantically for any sign of where they could have gone. I walked to the building entrance and looked inside. They weren't there. I circled the entire building, checking all the other entrances and exits. No sign of them. I even went back to the picnic area where they had been eating lunch, thinking maybe I had somehow gotten confused and they had returned to their table. But their white minivan was still parked where they had left it, and there was no trace of them anywhere. By this time, Mark had noticed that I'd been gone for a while and had come looking for me with Connor and Tyler in tow. I tried to explain what I had seen, but it sounded crazy even to my own ears. A family had vanished into thin air in broad daylight at a busy rest stop with dozens of witnesses around. But Mark has been married to me long enough to know that I don't imagine things or make up stories for attention. If I said something strange had happened, he was willing to listen and help me figure it out. We spent the next hour searching the entire rest area and questioning other people who had been there during the lunch period. Several people remembered seeing the family I described: the white minivan, the parents and 2 children, the unusually quiet and well-organized behavior during their picnic lunch. But nobody had seen them leave their picnic table, and nobody had witnessed them walking toward the building or disappearing. One elderly man who had been sitting on a bench near the main building specifically remembered looking in that direction at the time I claimed the family had vanished. He insisted that he would have noticed a family of 4 walking toward the entrance, and he was certain that no such group had passed by his location. We contacted the rest area management and asked them to check their security cameras. The facility had multiple cameras covering the parking areas and building entrances, and they were able to review the footage from the time period when the family had been there. The security video showed the family arriving in their white minivan, setting up their picnic lunch, eating in silence, and cleaning up their table. But when they should have been walking toward the building, the cameras showed something impossible. The family simply faded out of existence over the course of about 10 seconds, becoming progressively more transparent until they disappeared completely. The rest area manager was as baffled as we were. He made copies of the relevant footage and said he would report the incident to local law enforcement, but he'd never seen anything like it in 20 years of working at highway facilities. We filed a missing persons report with the South Dakota State Police, providing the license plate number of the white minivan and detailed descriptions of all 4 family members. But when they ran the plates, they discovered that the vehicle had been reported stolen from a long-term parking lot at the Des Moines airport 6 months earlier. The car's registered owners were a couple from Cedar Rapids, who had been on vacation in Europe at the time of the theft and had never had any children. The investigation continued for several weeks, but no trace of the missing family was ever found. The stolen minivan remained in the rest area parking lot for 3 days before being towed and processed for evidence. But it yielded no useful clues about the identity of the people who had been using it. Local and state police interviewed dozens of witnesses who had been at the rest area that day. But nobody could provide any additional information about what had happened to the family or where they might have gone. The security camera footage was analyzed by digital forensics experts, but they could offer no explanation for how or why 4 people had gradually faded from visibility over a 10-second period. The case was eventually classified as a missing persons investigation with unknown circumstances, and it remains unsolved to this day. We continued on with our family vacation, but the experience cast a shadow over what should have been a fun weekend getaway. Connor and Tyler were too young to fully understand what had happened, but they picked up on Mark's and my anxiety and kept asking questions about the invisible family for weeks after we returned home. I still think about that family regularly, especially when I'm working with children who seem too quiet, too compliant, too perfectly well-behaved for their age. I wonder if those children were in some kind of danger, if their unusual behavior was a sign that something terrible was happening to them. I wonder if their disappearance was somehow connected to whatever had been wrong with their family dynamics. Most of all, I wonder if they're still out there somewhere, trapped in that same rigid, silent routine, waiting for someone to notice that they need help. My name is Jimmy, and I've been a long-haul trucker for 18 years, covering routes across the western United States. In all that time driving through some of the most remote and challenging terrain in the country, I've encountered just about every kind of weather, road condition, and emergency situation you can imagine. Mountain passes in blizzards, desert highways in 120-degree heat, ice storms, flash floods. I thought I'd seen it all. But nothing in my experience prepared me for what happened during a winter storm in the Colorado Rockies in February 2023. I was hauling a load of electronics from Denver to Salt Lake City, taking Highway 6 through the mountains because I-70 was closed due to avalanche danger. The weather had been deteriorating all day, with snow starting as light flurries in the morning, but gradually building into a full-scale blizzard by late afternoon. Visibility was getting worse by the hour, and the wind was picking up to the point where it was becoming difficult to keep my rig steady on the road. Around 8 p.m., I was climbing through a particularly treacherous section of highway when the storm intensified beyond anything I'd ever experienced. The snow was coming down so heavily that my headlights could barely penetrate more than a few feet ahead, and the wind was creating whiteout conditions that made it impossible to see the road markings or guardrails. My CB radio was picking up reports from other drivers about multiple accidents and road closures, and it was becoming clear that continuing in these conditions would be suicidal. When I saw the lights of what appeared to be a rest area ahead, I made the decision to pull off and wait out the worst of the storm. I've been driving long enough to know that no delivery schedule is worth risking your life for. And this blizzard was rapidly approaching the kind of conditions that kill people who try to push through them. The rest area was one of those high-altitude facilities designed specifically for mountain highway conditions. Substantial buildings built to withstand severe weather, with covered areas for vehicles and emergency shelter capabilities. As I pulled into the parking area, I could see several other vehicles already there. A few cars, another semi-truck, and what looked like an RV that had probably been trapped by the storm, just like I was. I parked my rig in a spot that offered some protection from the wind, and made my way to the main building, fighting through snow that was already knee-deep in the areas where it had drifted. The wind was howling with a ferocity that made it difficult to hear anything else, and the temperature was dropping fast enough that I could feel the cold penetrating through my heavy winter jacket. The building's main entrance was heavy and well sealed against the weather, and when I pushed through it, I was grateful to find myself in a warm, well-lit space that offered obvious refuge from the brutal conditions outside. There were maybe a dozen other people already there. Other stranded travelers who had made the same decision. I had to seek shelter rather than risk continuing in the storm. Most of them were huddled in the main lobby area, sitting on benches or standing near the large windows that normally would have offered spectacular views of the mountain landscape, but now showed nothing but swirling snow and darkness. The mood was generally calm but concerned. Everyone understood we were dealing with a serious weather event. But the facility seemed well equipped to handle the situation, and nobody appeared to be panicking. I was settling in for what I figured would be a long night when one of the facility maintenance workers approached me. He was a man in his 50s, wearing the kind of heavy-duty winter clothing that suggested he was accustomed to working in harsh mountain conditions. His name tag identified him as Dave, and he had the weathered look of someone who'd spent years dealing with Colorado winters. "You picked a hell of a night to be traveling," he said with the kind of dark humor that mountain people use to cope with dangerous weather. "Tell me about it," I replied. "Any idea how long this is supposed to last?" "Weather Service is saying it could go on for another 12 to 15 hours, he said, shaking his head. "This is one of the worst storms we've seen in years. You folks are going to be here for a while." He paused and looked around at the growing number of stranded travelers filling up the main lobby area. "Actually," he continued, "if you're interested, I can show you to a warmer area downstairs. It's not open to the public normally, but we use it for situations like this when we've got a lot of people who need to stay overnight." The offer sounded reasonable, and the main lobby was getting pretty crowded and noisy with all the stranded travelers. The idea of a quieter, warmer space to wait out the storm was definitely appealing. "That would be great," I said. "Lead the way." Dave led me to a door marked "Authorized Personnel Only" that I hadn't noticed before, tucked away in an alcove near the restrooms. He produced a set of keys and unlocked it, revealing a staircase that descended into what appeared to be a basement level of the facility. "We don't usually bring people down here," he explained as we walked down the concrete steps. "But this storm is exceptional circumstances. The heating system works better down here, and there are some cots and chairs if you want to try to get some sleep." The basement level was indeed warmer than the main lobby, and it was laid out differently than I'd expected. Instead of the utilitarian basement space I'd anticipated, it was more like a series of connected rooms with finished walls, carpeting, and comfortable lighting. Dave led me through what appeared to be a common area with chairs and tables, then down a corridor lined with doors. "Storage areas mostly," he explained when he noticed me, looking at the doors. "We keep supplies, emergency equipment, that sort of thing." But as we walked deeper into the underground area, I started noticing things that didn't seem consistent with a typical rest area storage facility. Some of the doors had small windows, and when I glanced through them, I could see what appeared to be furnished rooms, not storage areas, but spaces that looked like they were designed for people to occupy. One room contained several beds with neat white linens. Another had comfortable chairs arranged in a circle like a therapy group setting. A third appeared to be set up like a small office with a desk, filing cabinets, and computer equipment. "What exactly is all this?" I asked Dave. "Oh, we use these for different purposes," he said vaguely. "Sometimes we get travelers who need medical attention, or families with small children who need a quiet place to rest. The state gives us funding to provide enhanced services during emergency situations." His explanation sounded reasonable enough, but something about the setup was making me increasingly uncomfortable. The rooms we were passing were too well appointed, too permanent-looking to be simple emergency shelters. They looked like they were designed for extended occupancy rather than temporary storm refuge. We continued walking down the corridor, passing more doors, more rooms that I could glimpse through small windows. Some were dark and appeared empty, but others showed signs of recent use: unmade beds, personal belongings scattered around, the general disorder that suggests people had been living in these spaces. "How many people are staying down here?" I asked. "Oh, we've got space for quite a few," Dave replied, but he didn't give me a specific number. "Don't worry, there's plenty of room." We reached the end of the corridor, and Dave opened a door that led into a larger room furnished with several cots, chairs, and a small table. "You can make yourself comfortable here," he said. "There are blankets in that closet, and there's a bathroom just down the hall." I thanked him and set down my overnight bag. But I was becoming increasingly uneasy about the situation. Something about this underground facility didn't feel right, and Dave's evasive answers to my questions were setting off alarm bells in my head. After Dave left, supposedly to check on other stranded travelers, I decided to do some exploring on my own. I walked back down the corridor we'd come through, taking a closer look at the rooms through their windows. What I saw made my blood run cold. The rooms weren't just furnished, they were personalized. Some contained family photographs, children's toys, clothing hung in closets, and other personal belongings that suggested people had been living in these spaces for extended periods. This wasn't an emergency shelter operation. It was something else entirely. In one room, I could see suitcases and travel bags stacked neatly against one wall, with license plates from different states mounted on the wall like trophies. Another room contained what appeared to be driver's licenses, credit cards, and other identification documents arranged in clear plastic sleeves like a collection. I tried the handle on one of the doors and found it unlocked. Inside, the room was set up like a small apartment with a bed, dresser, small refrigerator, and television. On the dresser were family photos showing what appeared to be a middle-aged couple with 2 teenage children, along with travel brochures for various national parks and tourist destinations. But the most disturbing discovery was a bulletin board mounted on one wall that contained what appeared to be missing person flyers. Dozens of them, all featuring photos of individuals and families who had disappeared while traveling through Colorado and surrounding states. Some of the flyers were yellowed with age, suggesting they'd been there for years. I backed out of the room quickly and continued down the corridor, my heart racing as I began to understand what this place really was. This wasn't a rest area with emergency shelter capabilities. It was some kind of collection point where travelers who got stranded during storms were brought and never allowed to leave. The personal belongings, the identification documents, the missing person flyers, they all pointed to the same horrifying conclusion. Dave, and whoever else was running this operation, were using severe weather events as opportunities to trap vulnerable travelers, people who would disappear during storms when search and rescue efforts would be delayed or impossible. I needed to get out of there immediately. But when I tried to retrace my steps back to the staircase, I discovered that the corridor layout had somehow changed. The path that Dave and I had taken to reach my assigned room was no longer there. Instead, I found myself in a section of the underground facility that I hadn't seen before. With different rooms and different corridors branching off, it's in directions that didn't make sense based on my memory of the building's layout. I spent what felt like hours trying to find my way back to the staircase. But the underground area seemed to be much larger and more complex than should have been possible. I passed dozens of rooms, some occupied by people who appeared to be sleeping or resting, others filled with personal belongings and travel gear that suggested many previous visitors had been brought here and never left. Some of the occupied rooms contained people who looked like they'd been there for a long time. Their clothes were worn and faded. Their appearance suggested poor nutrition and limited access to proper hygiene facilities. When I tried to communicate with them through the windows, they either didn't respond or gave me blank, vacant stares that suggested psychological trauma or medication. Finally, after what my watch showed as nearly 6 hours underground, I found a different staircase that led up to what appeared to be a mechanical room, filled with heating and electrical equipment. From there, I was able to find a service entrance that led outside into the still raging blizzard. The cold hit me like a physical blow, but I preferred the deadly mountain storm to whatever was happening in that underground facility. I fought my way through the deep snow to where I'd parked my truck, started the engine, and began the dangerous process of getting back onto the highway despite the continuing whiteout conditions. I drove for 3 hours through some of the worst weather I've ever experienced, barely able to see the road and stopping frequently to clear ice from my windshield. But eventually, the storm began to clear, and I was able to make it to a truck stop in Grand Junction where I called the Colorado State Police and tried to report what I'd discovered. The dispatcher listened to my story, but seemed skeptical about the details. When state troopers checked the rest area the following day, they found a normal, well-maintained facility with no underground levels beyond a standard basement containing heating and maintenance equipment. There was no sign of the elaborate underground complex I described, no evidence of missing persons materials, and no employee named Dave. The official conclusion was that I'd become disoriented during the blizzard and had somehow confused multiple locations or experienced hallucinations due to stress and exhaustion. But I know what I saw in that underground facility, and I know those missing person flyers were real. I still drive mountain routes regularly, but I never stop at remote rest areas during severe weather anymore. When storms hit, I find truck stops or motels in populated areas rather than risk getting stranded at facilities that might not be what they appear to be. Sometimes I search online for missing person cases from Colorado and surrounding states, looking for faces that might match the photos I saw in that underground collection. I've found several that look familiar, but without more specific information or evidence, there's nothing I can do except wonder how many travelers have disappeared into that maze of underground rooms, and whether they're still down there, waiting for someone to find them. My name is Devin, and I honestly can't tell you how long I've been trying to leave this rest stop. Time doesn't seem to work the same way here as it does in the outside world, and my memories of what happened before I arrived are getting hazier with each passing hour, day. I'm not even sure anymore. I think I was driving somewhere. I have flashes of memory, being behind the wheel of my car, music playing on the radio, the sensation of highway miles passing beneath my tires. But the details are slipping away like water through my fingers. Was I going to visit someone? Coming home from work? Taking a vacation? The harder I try to remember, the more the memories seem to dissolve. What I do remember clearly is pulling into this rest stop because I needed to use the bathroom. It looked completely ordinary. A standard highway facility with brick buildings, picnic tables, and a parking area that could accommodate maybe 30 vehicles. Nothing unusual, nothing that would have given me any reason to be cautious or concerned. I parked in a space near the main building, used the restroom, bought a soda from a vending machine, and walked back to my car. Simple, routine, forgettable. Except when I got back in my car and drove toward the exit, something went wrong. Instead of merging back onto whatever highway I'd been traveling, I found myself pulling into the same rest stop again. Same building, same parking spaces, same vending machines. At first, I thought I'd gotten confused and somehow made a wrong turn, maybe driven in a circle around the facility without realizing it. So I tried again. I parked, got out of my car, and walked around the entire perimeter of the rest stop to get my bearings. There was definitely only one entrance and one exit, and they connected to what appeared to be a normal highway with traffic moving in both directions. Nothing complicated about the layout, nothing that should have caused any confusion. I got back in my car, drove carefully toward the exit, and paid close attention to every turn and merge. I made sure I was heading in the right direction, checked my mirrors, watched the road signs. But within what felt like 5 minutes of driving, I was pulling into the same rest stop again. That's when I started to panic. I tried different approaches, driving faster, driving slower, taking the entrance ramp in reverse to see if that would somehow break whatever pattern I was caught in. I tried getting out of my car at the highway entrance and walking along the road to see where it led. I tried calling for help on my cell phone, but I had no signal despite being on what should have been a major highway. Nothing worked. Every attempt to leave the rest stop resulted in me arriving back at the rest stop within minutes, pulling into the same parking area as if I'd never left at all. The worst part is the other people. There are maybe 15 or 20 other individuals here at any given time. Men, women, children, elderly couples, solo travelers like myself. They all seem to be going through the normal motions of rest stop visitors, using the facilities, eating snacks, stretching their legs, checking their phones. But none of them seem to notice that we're all trapped here. I've tried talking to them, explaining the situation, asking if they've experienced the same problem with being unable to leave. But their responses are always vague and disconnected, like they're not really hearing what I'm saying or understanding the implications of what I'm telling them. A woman in a blue jacket will smile and nod when I explain that I've been trying to leave for hours, then immediately ask me if I know what time it is or whether I think it's going to rain. An elderly man will listen politely to my description of driving in circles, then tell me about his grandchildren as if we're having a completely different conversation. The children are the worst. They play on the small playground equipment or run around the grassy areas. But they never get tired, never ask their parents when they're leaving, never show any awareness that anything unusual is happening. They just repeat the same activities over and over, swinging on the same swing, climbing the same piece of equipment, playing the same games. I've started paying attention to the patterns, trying to document what I observe to maintain some sense of sanity and purpose. The woman in the blue jacket always sits at the same picnic table and eats the same bag of chips. The elderly man always walks his small dog along the same path around the perimeter of the facility. A family with teenage children always has the same conversation about their travel plans while looking at the same road atlas. The repetition is exact, mechanical, like watching a video loop play over and over again. These people aren't just trapped here like I am. They're stuck repeating the same actions, the same conversations, the same behaviors, without any awareness that they've done it all before. I've tried disrupting their patterns, inserting myself into their routines to see if I can break the cycle. I'll sit at the woman's picnic table before she gets there, or I'll stand in the path where the elderly man walks his dog. But they simply adjust around me, as if I'm not there, finding new ways to complete their predetermined actions while maintaining the same essential behaviors. My car is always parked in the same spot when I return from my failed escape attempts, even though I remember parking it in different locations. My fuel gauge always shows the same level. My odometer never changes. My clock displays times that don't seem to follow any logical sequence. Sometimes it shows morning, sometimes afternoon, sometimes evening. But the lighting and weather never change to match. I've explored every inch of this rest stop looking for clues, answers, or escape routes. The building interiors are always the same. Clean restrooms, functioning, vending machines, informational displays about local attractions and highway conditions. But when I read the displays carefully, the information doesn't make sense. The text describes places that don't exist, highways with impossible route numbers, and historical events that I'm sure never happened. There's a bulletin board near the entrance with community announcements and local information, but the content changes in ways that don't follow any pattern I can understand. Sometimes there are flyers for missing persons, sometimes job listings for positions that don't seem real, sometimes event announcements for activities that are supposedly happening right now in multiple different time periods. I found a flyer for a missing person that looked familiar, and when I studied it more closely, I realized it was me. My own photograph, my own name, my own description. According to the flyer, I disappeared 3 months ago while traveling through this area. But that can't be right, because I only arrived here. How long ago? Hours? Days? The more I try to calculate how much time has passed, the more confused I become. There are other missing person flyers too, featuring people I recognize from the rest stop. The woman in the blue jacket, the elderly man with the dog, several members of the family with teenagers. All reported missing at different times over the past several years, all last seen in this general area. I think we're all trapped here together, caught in some kind of temporal loop that prevents us from leaving or even fully understanding our situation. The others have been here longer than I have, and the repetitive behavior patterns seem to be a side effect of extended exposure to whatever is keeping us here. They've lost their awareness of the loop, their memory of their previous lives, their ability to recognize that anything is wrong. I can feel it happening to me too. Each cycle through the loop, my memories from before arriving here become a little fainter, a little less detailed. My sense of urgency about escaping diminishes slightly each time I fail to find a way out. The bizarre situation starts to feel more normal, more acceptable, more like just the way things are rather than a problem that needs to be solved. Sometimes I catch myself going through the same motions as the other trapped people, sitting at the same picnic table, walking the same paths, having the same thoughts in the same sequence. When I realize what's happening, I can break out of the pattern temporarily, but it takes more effort each time, and the patterns become more compelling with each repetition. I'm writing this down while I still remember who I am and why I need to escape, but I can feel my grip on reality loosening with each loop. Soon, I'll probably join the others in their mindless repetition, going through the motions of being a rest stop visitor without any memory of my previous life or awareness that I'm trapped. If you're reading this somehow, if this account survives when I don't, please remember that we're here. We're real people who had lives and families and dreams before we got caught in this place. We didn't choose to disappear, and we don't deserve to be forgotten. Don't stop at rest areas alone, especially in remote areas or during unusual circumstances. Don't ignore the feeling that something isn't right about a place or situation. Trust your instincts, and if something feels wrong, leave immediately and don't look back. And if you ever find yourself at what seems like an ordinary rest stop but notice that you can't leave, or that other people are behaving strangely, or that time doesn't seem to work normally, run. Fight against it with everything you have. Don't let it normalize. Don't let it become acceptable. Don't let it take your memories and your sense of self like it's taking mine. Remember us. Remember that we were real. And whatever you do, don't let yourself become another missing person flyer on a bulletin board that no one will ever read. Have you ever experienced something unexplainable at a rest stop during your travels? Has a routine pit stop ever turned into something that still haunts you years later? I want to hear from you. Share your story in the comments below. Whether it's a strange encounter with other travelers, an unexplained disappearance you witnessed, or a facility that didn't seem quite right, your experience could help other travelers stay safe, or it might provide answers for families still searching for missing loved ones. Don't forget to subscribe to Verified Fears for more true horror stories that will make you think twice about your next road trip. Hit that notification bell so you never miss our latest investigations into the unexplained encounters that happen in the places we least expect them. And remember, when you are out there on the highways, trust your instincts. Sometimes the most ordinary places hide the most extraordinary dangers. Stay safe out there and keep your eyes open. You never know what's waiting at the next rest stop.